Well, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in online. I'm feeling very strange here, sitting at a lectern or standing at a lectern with an empty room, except for a couple of people, but nevertheless, I'm delighted to be here. So I'm Ken Newcombe. I graduated from the John Curtin School of Medical Research, as you saw in my CV, and that was a long time ago, more than 40 years. And now towards the end of my career, I am the founder and CEO of Sequest Capital. And Sequest Capital is one of the largest producers of greenhouse gas emissions reductions for the emerging voluntary carbon market. And our focus is on the poorest communities in the poorest countries in the world. We have as our core business providing clean cooking services to women in the rural areas of developing countries. The largest part of our business is in sub-Saharan Africa, but we have similar projects in Central America and across South and East Asia. Every day that goes by, we install 2 stoves in around 1,000 households a day. It's the wet season now in Africa, but in the peak, it's 3,000 households and 6,000 cook stoves a day. We are a diversified enterprise. At the moment, we're commissioning a solar panel production facility in Cape Town, which will be run entirely by women. And we have a manufacturing facility for the parts for our cook stoves for our rural families in Lilongwe, which is the largest producer of cook stoves in Africa. The focus of our business, in every way that we can make it, is on the health and prosperity of women and girls. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in my discussion. So why am I here? I'm sure you were wondering. I'm here because I realized that the Frank Fenner School has been established. It was a relatively recent discovery for me. And Frank Fenner was a mentor for me. He was my examiner and even an advocate, presenting my doctoral thesis for the university medal at the time. I was inspired by his vision. It was quite amazing to me that one of the world's leading virologists, towards the peak of his career, decided that there was a much larger issue of limits to growth, of sustainability. Sustainable development was not a common term in those days, but the limitations and challenges of a rapidly expanding global population and a rapidly expanding urban population occurred to him to be one of the most important challenges of his time. And so he was a sponsor of research into the constraints of growth and allowed me to do the work that I did in the relatively new area of human ecology. I studied the human ecology of Hong Kong, looking at the relationship between patterns of energy use and health. And right at the end of my career, I've come back full circle to focusing on the relationship between household air pollution and health for women and infants worldwide. My career was unusual. To be a human ecologist in that time was not widely known, and certainly to come out of a medical research school was exceptional. But the training I had here was really an integration in understanding enough of quite a few disciplines that were bearing on the fate of humanity, and to be able to integrate that knowledge in some meaningful way to give some direction to sustainable development. I moved to the energy sector away from medical research relatively early in my career, because while I was in Hong Kong, the oil crisis broke out, and I realized that what I had to do to determine exactly where energy was used and where the byproducts were distributed to have impacts on health was also the foundation of a new profession of energy planning and management. and that intrigued me, and I drifted more into energy planning, but never lost sight of the energy, environment, and health nexus. That background and that inspiration that Fenner provided to me allowed me through my career to take advantage of it in unforeseen ways. I was a designer, co-designer of the Global Environment Facility, and the first manager, chief investment officer of the distribution of funds for the Global Environment Facility, which addressed the externalities of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution of international waters. And I set up the multilateral fund of the Montreal Protocol in the World Bank to reduce the emissions of ozone-depleting substances. Now, all along the way, the unusual career that I was launched into from the ANU was really founded by the visionary nature of Frank Fenner and Stephen Boyden that I learned a great deal from. Let me tell you about the voluntary carbon market. The voluntary carbon market is the vehicle by which corporates all around the world are committing to net zero outcomes in terms of the environmental impacts of their goods and services. Some of them quite obvious, major oil companies that are committing by 2050 to completely neutralize the impact of all of their products, all of their scope 3 emissions. But there are now more than 5,000 companies who in one way or another have committed to be partially or completely net zero by 2030. And then onwards, almost all of them talk about 2050, which of course is a very long time away. To me, the voluntary carbon market is an extraordinary opportunity to channel flexible capital through private sector channels to the poorest countries of the world. The institutions that have been endowed with the responsibility for development, one of which I worked for 24 years, mostly as a senior manager, the World Bank, to my mind, have failed to address the problems of sustainable development for the rural communities of the developing countries. There are many reasons for that. They're intermediated by governments, which is a primary reason, and governments have limited capacity outside of the urban areas. And NGOs who try and fill the gap are really going from hand to mouth, have a limited incentive structure and limited continuity. So the voluntary carbon market and the funds that are flowing in to create greenhouse gas emissions for trade to meet the demands of all of the corporates who've made net zero commitments is a remarkable pool of flexible capital that can be truly transformational. The scale of this market is also unprecedented, and its horizon going out to 2030, 2040, 2050 makes it a much more secure commodity for investment. The funds that are likely to flow are in dispute, but most people talk in terms of $100 billion a year by 2030. Now that does rest on a foundation of $50 to $100 a ton. I personally don't think that prices will get to that level, but I do think prices in the range of $30 to $40 a ton by 2030 are inevitable. And even within the next 3 to 4 years, I expect prices will be about $25 to $30 for most kinds of assets. But there's a really interesting feature of the voluntary carbon market. It is that it's split between two asset classes. One is avoidance, avoiding emissions to come into the atmosphere, for example, by investing in energy efficiency, by switching away from fossil fuels to renewables. And the other is removals, sometimes called nature-based solutions, which is focused on removing carbon from the atmosphere for its biological sequestration, mostly biological, in afforestation, even avoiding deforestation, and in sustainable agriculture and other forms of biological sequestration. The NGOs that are promoting corporate action are strongly emphasizing removals, which I certainly do not agree with, but the price differentiation is at least threefold at the moment. So the emissions reductions that my company mostly gives rise to today, which are through avoiding the use of open fires for cooking, avoiding the use of charcoal for cooking, and replacing that with biomass from sustainable sources, almost 100% sustainable, and therefore reducing carbon going to the atmosphere. That's an avoidance credit. And we're currently selling those credits for around $6 or $7. And the indexes in the market, which are relatively poorly informed, price those assets at around about $9. But equally, for the removals activities that I'm also pursuing as an extension of our relationship with rural women in Africa, having them take, for example, bamboo or other seedlings and planting them next to their homes or in their gardens, and GPSing every single tree and getting virtual plantations, I'm able to sell those emissions reductions for between $17 and $20. Now, I can tell you, having been a founder of the global carbon market in many respects, that there is no serious difference in the integrity of these two assets. But major corporates like Nestle, Unilever, are totally committed to fulfilling their net zero obligations only through removals. And I think that's creating tremendous stress on them. And I see that through the marketplace. For example, Netflix, who made a similar commitment to us or to the global public to only purchase removals, finds that financially punitive, and has recently bought from us 1 million tons a year of gas leak detection and loss reduction emissions, sealing leaky gas pipelines in Bangladesh that serve poor communities, which is a classical and very important form of avoidance, because they simply couldn't find, on the one hand, the volume of removals credits that they wanted, and they didn't want to pay an exorbitant price for it. So maybe that bifurcation of the market is going to shrink over time, but some major corporates simply are wealthy enough and will persist. And so that bifurcation will continue. The interesting thing about the market, frankly, is that in terms of meeting the obligations that all parties to the Paris Agreement have committed to of a 1.50 degree world, all of these, something like 4 or 5 gigatons that could be achieved inside the voluntary carbon market with all of these commitments from 5,000 plus corporates worldwide, will only be about 5% of that obligation. So you ask, what does it matter? What it matters, as far as I'm concerned, is that the use of these funds can be truly transformational. Everything that we do in Sequest asks the question about what do you do beyond carbon. In the avoidance sphere, it's not credible to me that we would be banking on emissions reductions to transform clean cooking in rural areas or to switch people away from charcoal in urban areas of the poorest countries, where it dominates as a fuel, after 10 years. These projects have lives of only about 10 years. So in that time frame, our challenge is to make it a matter of behavior and good practice for communities to use cleaner cooking technologies, and a matter of financial viability and simply better amenity to use pellet fuels, sustainably harvested stick wood, and to move away from charcoal. That is a difficult challenge for long-term transformation, for survival in a climate-constrained world. But there are others that are even more important, and which the catalytic power of billions of dollars of climate finance can actually give rise to. For example, if you invest in lithium-ion or lithium phosphate battery storage at a utility scale, and you use carbon finance to buy down the costs of those batteries to bring the learning curve, the price curve down from the current $200,000 per megawatt hour to $80,000 per megawatt hour, then solar as a base load source of energy is cheaper than any fossil fuel. And that transformation to an entirely renewable-based grid, serving the off-peak, the evening peaks and the morning peaks outside of sunshine with solar energy, that will become a reality if carbon finance is used to buy down the cost of batteries at this point and drive the price down. Last week, I came to an agreement with Regenerative Agricultural Farmers of Australia to incorporate them in a new business called CQC Soils in Australia, with the ambition of bringing 250,000 hectares of agricultural land in Australia into regenerative agricultural practices. Fundamentally, that means changing the way people do business in agriculture, mostly broadacre, from a chemicalized industrial pattern of agriculture to one which enhances the soil microbiome, restores fungi and bacteria, restores organic matter, which is obviously the foodstuff for this microbiome. And the truth is, after 4 or 5 years of practicing regenerative agriculture in various cropping and farming systems, farmers will not go back to the old way of doing business because their soils will be more fertile, their soils will retain much more moisture, they'll be much less vulnerable to drought and increasing climate variability. And that role of carbon finance will be truly transformational. That to me is the most important role for the voluntary carbon market, using private capital, being nimble, agile, bringing new technology to bear, changing behavior and technology permanently so that systems that are fundamental to health, to food and water security are permanently transformed and no longer need to depend on revenue from the sale of carbon credits. And that's certainly the ambition of Sequest Capital. Let me switch to the second part of the topic, which is the primary focus of our business, improving the health and prosperity of women and girls. I said earlier on that I felt that the development paradigm was broken with respect to serving the needs of rural communities. When I left Papua New Guinea and joined the World Bank after a period of time, I was still a research fellow here, but finished my last year of my research fellowship and went on to the World Bank. The first place I visited was Ethiopia, and I was completely blown away by what I saw. Women carrying sticks on their back, heavy burdens, seemingly over very long distances, no trees anywhere in the landscape. Where they were coming from, where they were going to was mystifying, but it was a common sight. Women obviously traveling many miles a day to get wood from a deforested landscape, mismanaged by a state-run economy, and just by a failure to recognize what was important to sustain land management. What's happening in the rest of Africa is really the Ethiopianization of sub-Saharan Africa. And it occurred to me that the most important thing we can do in the modern era is save women from that burden, improve their health and well-being, avoid the need for girls to go outside their village communities and suffer physical abuse and rape and get pregnant far too early, and to save them time. So our research shows that we can save women 1 to 2 hours a day, and we can dramatically improve their health and well-being for 2 reasons. One that I just mentioned, carrying wood on your head, 20, 30 kilos over very long distances every second or third day for your life, obviously has significant impact on your muscle tissue, your nervous tissue, and your ability to function. Women are the agents of economic growth in rural areas of developing countries. if their prosperity and their health is not protected, the opportunity for sustainable development is pretty much lost. So what we do through clean cooking is not just mitigate emissions reductions. We give women time and we give them health. And the other part of the health brings me back to my origins here in the John Curtin School, at least at the time that I studied here. It's that the particulate matter that is absorbed by women and little children on their back while cooking over an open fire is the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. I often say to women that one of the most enjoyable things of my life at the moment is talking to women in rural areas, especially in Africa. And I ask them, do you want your baby to smoke? And they think it's a joke. The truth is, they are smoking. And as you know, more than 4 million people die prematurely in the developing countries through inhaling particulate matter from cooking on open fires, and it's getting worse rather than better. There's more now than there were 10 years ago. At the same time as taking away through cleaner, more complete combustion and through use of crop materials that are all around, small stick-sized wood that's common, maize cobs that are common and thrown away, making combustion systems that cook faster and cleaner for these women, which is what we do every day. And to give them time, we create the basis for their prosperity. The next step is to provide them with insights on agriculture and food and all kinds of ventures which they can pursue to use their improved health and their time. That's really the focus of what we do. So how do we do that? First, we recycle profits. So a significant part of the profits of our business go back to support families who are continuing to use cleaner cooking services. That's the essential. There's a parable which we always talk about. You look after your stove and your stove will look after you. So keep the foundation and we'll build around it. So we now fund education through to university for disadvantaged girls. We provide for women, village savings and loan, injections of capital into their savings and loan societies at the community level. We provide drip irrigation kits for women to grow food in the dry season and to avoid the gap at the end of the dry season when their granaries have run out and they're hungry, even in the face of their corn growing, until they have harvestable corn. But most important, the next step in our journey is to teach them sustainable agriculture. Again, I like to talk about regenerative agriculture. It's zero till, it's residue retention, it's a combination of various agroforestry species. The first step is to fill any gap in the year, so there's no food deficit. The second is to create a surplus, and the third step is to provide an access to market for the high value goods that we can help them get access to. That development paradigm, private sector led, catalyzed by carbon finance in the modern era, is a virtuous cycle of mutual prosperity, which we're trying to demonstrate and draw other capital into that environment. We're also creating 2 products in results-based financing. One is time savings, to record the time savings, default factors which are associated with the use of the stoves, and to be able to sell forward time saved on a heavily discounted estimate of time savings for 5 to 10 years, depending on what stoves and what part of the world, and to have that money paid up front. It can be even as much as $1,000, but certainly at least $200, and delivered to the woman in a menu of goods and services, not cash, that she can choose from and that we can deliver to her through our foundation, now being set up, called Us Women, clearly not run by me, that provides them with the opportunity to be entrepreneurs or to get to the next level of prosperity. That is a methodology which you will soon be able to see published, and where we simply say you buy a stove for the woman that generates these time savings. So pay forward for that time savings at 10 or 20 cents an hour. Realize this cash resource up front, and in different parts of the world, we can deliver different kinds of goods and services as our commitment to the family. The second part of this is a little more complex. It's to do with the reduction, the measured reduction of particulate matter, which of course is associated with the dose response, exposure response curves that have emerged over now 30 or 40 years of research, which show that you can bring particulate matter down with different combustion systems to the point where you really are beginning to make a significant reduction in the burden of disease that follows from inhaling PM2.5. Obviously, you would imagine respiratory disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, heart disease, but there are much more subtle things going on. Premature births, underweight births, blindness. All of these things are incredible impediments to growth, impediments to prosperity. We're creating a methodology which is based on reduction in PM2.5 with some leading epidemiologists in the US. And that methodology will say to the gender community and the health-based community, not the climate community. These tend to be different buckets of money and they don't talk to each other very much. Say to them, if you're really caring about the health of women, like the Gates Foundation or the Buffett Foundation, why don't you pay on delivery for an averted disability adjusted life year? And here's the credible basis on which we're delivering that to you, or an avoided premature death. In that way, with a combination of climate finance and results-based financing for those who are not so much interested in climate, we can build prosperity for women and we can transform rural economies. Now, you might think that's a leap. Of course it's a leap. It's a stretch. Sequest alone can't do it, but we will build. We're already financed to build clean cooking services in 6 million households over the next 6 or 7 years. Our ambition is 1 million households served in 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and a similar ambition now with Temasek, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, in Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, and 6 million households in Northeast India and North India, and we service Central America. These are not beyond reach, but they're still a drop in the bucket. But what we intend to do is to demonstrate to capital that this should not be an ignored space because of high risk and perception that you would never want to go to the poorest countries and the poorest communities. That through this model of investing in their prosperity and your own prosperity at the time, you can go beyond carbon finance and create a development system which actually works and is sustainable through the marketplace. It does require different kinds of private companies. It does not suit an avaricious private sector model. It talks about the emerging set of companies who see themselves as having much broader social responsibility. And we hope to emulate that business model. Let me stop there and take any questions.
Thanks so much, Ken. We've got a question here from Ian Fry. Will Sequest align its practices to the rules of Article 6 under the Paris Agreement as agreed in Glasgow?
Someone translate, I can't hear them.
Yeah, the question is, how does that apply to the Paris Agreement terms on carbon markets? Mine is essentially the same. What's your credibility internationally with these activities? I mean, they only last 10 years. You want to see greenhouse reductions that last 50 years at least, 100 years preferably. That's a big issue, the whole credibility, verifiability.
No, it's a very good question. That's why in the avoidance sector in particular, I don't think it's responsible for companies to simply go and mine the market and just say, you know, what's the simplest way to get a greenhouse gas emission reduction while the market lives? I will capture that value and trade it. What's really important to make a difference, frankly, is to invest in activities with the objective of going beyond carbon to a carbon neutral pattern of management of economies. And in the energy sector, to my mind, that's moving away from fossil fuels to two really important things: solar energy and biomass fuels. So solar energy, because of what I told you before, at the utility scale can become the base load source of power. It's absolutely within reach. My company is investing in a 40 megawatt solar power plant in Malawi with 90 megawatt hours of battery storage to illustrate to Malawians that at a price of 9 cents per kilowatt hour, they can eliminate large proportions of their oil-based generation at the evening peak, eliminate oil in the evening peak and the morning peak, move away from a fossil fuel. That's still pretty expensive, but when you get down to less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour, which is possible with batteries, you've made that transformation. So let's not think about carbon finance being simply a commodity which people trade and create while the market is hot. Let's focus on activities which use carbon finance to transform all segments of the economy to a more climate neutral and more climate friendly pattern of management. Solar energy is really important. It's a high quality energy of electricity, but biomass fuels are also fundamental. It may be surprising for you to know that the US voyage to sustainable energy in the Paris world moves biomass fuels from 3% to 15%. And it has to do with sustainable production of biomass and delivering it in forms to households, like for heating in pellets and so on a much, much larger scale. And the technology that's being developed in the US with the agents of the design are the same people that I'm using to design clean cooking for urban areas to displace charcoal. So we have to think in these transformational terms. Long term, there is no question in my mind that the only way to really manage climate change is to move the entire food production system to regenerative farming. Why do I say that? Because it probably sounds heretical to you. It's because farmers, small and large, are well connected to the market. They already have significant channels for all kinds of inputs. And there's significant infrastructure, even for quite remote smallholders in Africa, to get products to market. That's very different from trying to grow trees on degraded land at a large scale. It's very different from the risky business of avoiding deforestation in Indonesia or in the Amazon basin or in the Congo basin. For governments who pledge management of forest resources to avoid deforestation when they really have no control, and on the other hand, they quite often are, by various means, agents of destruction. So I think we have in place through agriculture the opportunity to remove significant volumes of carbon from the atmosphere. We're at the beginning of that journey. I worked last year and the year before with Indigo Ag in the US to create a science-based methodology to open the global market to soil carbon. The Australian Clean Energy Regulators approved improvements in soil carbon methodologies. Still hasn't given rise to a large volume of emissions reductions. But because of that relative advantage, competitive advantage of existing infrastructure, I think it's the way to go. And bear in mind, there's more carbon in the atmosphere from degradation of soils than from loss of forests. That's an historical fact. We can go back the other way. I hope that helps.
We had another question, this one from Nick Abel. Please say more about how you would address the male opposition to your female-focused investments.
So can you?
Oh, you want to hear that again?
Yeah.
How do you get past male opposition to your female dedicated program?
That's a tough one. Having just visited my relatives in Borden Vale and around Polar Bay, I see it's still very male chauvinist society. Look, there's an economic reality that can't be denied. Who does the work? Who are the caregivers? Who grows the food in the developing countries? It's women. If you want to get something done, you have to talk to a woman. If you're in business, you figure that out pretty quickly. And it doesn't take too long for people to recognize that the agents of change in developing countries, especially in the rural areas, are women. So my thesis is, and I've so far been able to enjoy the success of that thesis, is that if you empower women, you make them healthier, provide them with better productivity through their health, and you save them time. And by the way, clean cooking is the only way to save a significant amount of time quickly for women. You can do it a little bit by giving them access to water pumps and so on, so they don't have to carry water on their heads for long distances. But it's not as powerful as transforming their cooking to fuels which are currently readily available and they can grow themselves. So that thesis stands up to scrutiny, and I actually see it being played out. So I don't think, male opposition is somewhat watered down by the ability to make money. And if you're trying to think in terms of viable pathways for profitability, males will also figure that out. You know, I did.
We had another question. Offsetting current emissions by corporations against cook stove fuel, which may or may not reduce emissions depending on how the fuel is sourced and whether there is a permanent fuel type, does not deliver net reduction in emissions. Therefore, it's not a solution to climate change. Clearly, improved cook stoves are important for human health, particularly women and children. Why does the carbon market need to fund this rather than, say, World Health Organization or the World Bank?
Yes, of course, I've heard that criticism before. I think it's important to understand the foundation of the methodologies which generate emissions reductions from cook stoves. What do they count? What don't they count? And what does cooking on an open fire really mean? First of all, there is a calculus of the proportion of wood that is drawn for use from the landscape for use in open fires, which is unsustainably harvested. That calculus is fairly rigorously determined, and it's related to analyses of the forage area that is accessible to village communities who are cooking on open fires. And it's clear that a significant proportion of the wood that is being gathered, cut, carried, and gathered and burned in open fires, all of it rather big diameter wood, by the way. A 3-stone fire can only be properly managed by wood that's like that, you know, or most like my arm, because women do not want to sit there feeding little bits of wood into an open fire where most of the wood, the heat is dissipated. So they prefer, and it's essential for time saving, for cooking on an open fire, to get big wood, which means chopping down trees and, or pollarding them to the point where they no longer survive. That's pretty credible. The fact is also, women do not put out open fires. It doesn't make any sense to them if they're cooking 3 times a day to pour water, even if they had it, on an open fire, because it's very hard to start again. So the truth is, if they move the 3 pieces of wood in with 3 stones in between, They just let them smolder on. And the products of partial combustion are nitrous oxide and methane, which are themselves powerful global warming gases. They have not historically been taken into account in determining the emissions reductions that come from inefficient cooking. That's now recognized by the IPCC and is incorporated in most of the methodologies for getting emissions reductions for trade from clean cooking. But by far the most dramatic of these is to avoid charcoal. I don't know whether you appreciate it, but probably 80% of urban Africa cooks on charcoal. There was this theory of the energy ladder that naturally people coming in from rural areas, they might be initially cooking on open fires. In urban areas, they'd quickly graduate to charcoal, but that would be a quick stepping stone. They would move to electricity and LPG, maybe through kerosene, which is a terrible fuel for cooking. But that was the ladder. And in the World Bank, I believed in that ladder. One of my roles in the World Bank in Africa was to provide investment advice for all of the World Bank's investment across all of the energy sector in Africa for a period of time. And I was guilty of promoting the concept of the energy ladder, but the ladder's broken. LPG is not readily available to most countries in Africa. It's a very important fuel, and I'm planning to invest in it myself, delivering it to landlocked countries for the upper middle class who would use it if they had access to it, but are currently using charcoal. But the truth is, and the other part of it is, electricity supply is notoriously poor. The poorest countries have 10, 15% connection of their populations to the grid. And even if they're connected at 30 or 40%, they're unreliable, substantial blackouts and brownouts. So large parts of the population are trapped in charcoal. Why does that matter? Well, the way people make charcoal is that it takes 10 to 15 tons of dry wood to make 1 ton of charcoal. Where does it come from? It comes from native forests. It's not coming from sustainable plantations. And as population grows, every 1% increase in urbanization increases the demand for charcoal by 10%. Even in making charcoal itself, which is pyrolysis, combustion in the absence of oxygen, oxygen-starved combustion to give rise to the charcoal as opposed to ashes, methane is given off, significant quantities of methane. It is by far the most damaging energy source on the planet. The loss of forest through charcoal production denies Africans the opportunity for sustainable water and food and sustainable agriculture. If we can do nothing else but eliminate charcoal as a cooking fuel in urban areas, we would still be doing a great favor for the world. Emissions reductions that are generated for trade in the global market by replacing charcoal with sustainably harvested biomass fuels, crop residues, forest residues made into pellets and briquettes, which we've tested and shown to be economically viable, with cooking technology, which is LPG equivalent. The combustion is supported by forced air through fans, fan-assisted combustion, and the combustion is near complete, 50 to 55% efficiency, and a heat rate faster than an LPG stove, but twice as fast in cooking and half the cost of charcoal. That's the voyage we're going on now, and we could not do that without carbon finance, because none of these technologies are familiar to people. They are wedded to a tradition of charcoal that is deeply embedded in their culture, and it drives this horrible process of land degradation and almost enslavement of the charcoal producers. So without carbon finance, we couldn't do what we're now planning to do. We're planning, for example, to eliminate charcoal over the next 5 years in Lilongwe, the capital of Malawi. And we have a suite of technologies that are now currently being handmade after design to be tested with households over the next few months. And that's a major assault on charcoal, which we hope to export for the rest of Africa. Okay.
Follow up on that.
Yeah.
If you've got a fan-based system, where's the electricity coming from to drive the fan?
It's from little solar panels. As I said, we're commissioning a solar panel production facility in Cape Town at the moment. And it's going to focus on 20 and 50 watt panels. Most of the previous versions of fan-assisted combustion, the stoves have been over $100, so only accessible to a small portion of the population. And the panels have been maybe 6 or 7 watts. And so just enough to power the fan, but not much more. Our approach is to produce both of these, the stoves and the panels. We can produce panels at less than half the cost of the imported Chinese panels, German technology, German certified. And we can supply and we can produce the pellet stoves and the fan-assisted stickwood stoves for between $20 and $25 each. We intend to produce lithium-ion batteries as well. That's a more expensive investment, so it's probably about a year and a half away. And we're looking at nanotechnology to switch away from lithium-ion batteries before we make a final decision. But the result is we deliver to a family a 20-watt panel, which has at least 80 watt hours a day surplus to the needs of the fan-assisted stove, which they can then use to charge their cell phones and for lighting and to play music, and women commonly sell cell phone charging services with the surplus. Or in the urban areas, they get into baking and selling baked goods and other things because they have surplus time and they have much cheaper energy. So it's a matter of how you perceive the needs of the client and create a product which is tailor-made to their needs. And that's effectively what we're doing. But the manufacturing is very important. Producing these in Africa, high quality, with good after-sales service, undermines the crappy stuff that comes in from China and provides a durable product. The poor are ripped off very frequently by low-quality stuff that doesn't last very long. But if you give them something which works, they'll pay for it.
Thank you. Following on that also, I think that's part of the technological challenges you mentioned at the beginning, to properly implement this. And you also mentioned about the financial challenges. What would be, I think I have been working in adaptation for a long time, and one of the things we have found for the financial mechanisms usually not readily available for farmers. People are usually don't have the access for those financial mechanisms. For these kind of things, I guess it's more or less similar. It's companies like you providing these services. Yeah. What would be the pathway or the recommendation for what needs to happen to transform the financial system so these things can be properly implemented?
Yeah. Starting from the bigger picture, the most important thing is to deliver them knowledge and technology, which can include even better seeds, and to avoid dependency on chemical fertilizers and rejuvenate the soil by improving soil organic matter, and of course, part of that is where I talk about soil carbon. Demonstrating those models to avoid the need for significant external inputs and to create the opportunity of surplus at the farm level. What's interesting about that is that if you catalyze that, and even with initially subsidized microfinance, and establish that farmers can become producers of surplus, small amounts even, for trade, then they become inherently creditworthy for microfinance institutions to take them over on a fully commercial basis. That's happening in Guatemala, for example, where we have a relationship with an organization that's fundamentally based on health, setting up surgical teams in remote areas for 10 times a year, but also focusing on the long-term prosperity of Guatemalan farmers. And they've certainly demonstrated that by switching them to hybrid seeds and improved residue retention and tillage practices, even within a period of a year, they can move people from a deficit to a surplus situation, which, by the way, is very potent in Guatemala and Central America, because the primary source of migration out to the US is desperation of poverty and no future for their kids. So they just give their kids to Coyote to take them to the border, and, it's a mess. And we're obviously looking at presenting to the US government a much smarter solution to that immigration problem of investing in sustainability at the level of the villages. And why would any woman want to send her kids to the US on a crapshoot if she can look after them and they can live prosperously there? So the short answer is, there's no magic about what to do. It's delivering it with the benefit of climate finance as a catalytic source of capital in the short term, demonstrate that this works, and then it will be transitioned to the conventional financial market, even despite the usury rates of microfinance. They will become creditworthy because they're able to create surpluses.
One more question coming through, and maybe that will take us up to, okay, 1 minute, and we'll take it up to the hour.
Okay.
I'm hoping you can say a bit more about the dynamics of the voluntary carbon market versus the compliant ETS model like the one we briefly had in Australia, particularly when it comes to the scale of action and the demand, and the creation of the demand for carbon offset credits. How do voluntary corporate commitments compare to compliance ETS as a source of demand for credits, and how will the voluntary purchase of offset credits mix in with other national climate policies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And clearly, a well-designed set of policies that affect every dimension of greenhouse gas emissions potential inside an economy is crucial. Offsets is not the solution in and of itself. That's clear from the proportionality that I told you earlier. Even at the maximum commitments of corporates today of around 5 gigatons a year offsets to meet their net zero obligations or commitments is about 5% of what's necessary to get to a 1.5 degree C world. Not that I think we're ever going to get to a 1.5 degree C world myself, but that's, putting it in proportion. And that's why I think the voluntary carbon market is of such a precious source of flexible capital. It's never been seen at this scale, having lived in development finance institutions for a lot of my life. I can tell you it's unique and has to be handled well to transform economies. But really the obligation is on industrializing countries. In fact, all countries with major emissions to sort of put in place sets of policies which lead to an infrastructure which is climate friendly in all of its dimensions. You can't do without that. The compliance markets are interesting in the post-Paris world. Governments, to varying degrees, will come to a conclusion that the marginal cost of abatement inside their economies is between $50 and $300, and that they simply can't get there by imposing that burden on their industry in a competitive world. So to varying degrees, countries will determine they need to go to the international market to buy emissions reductions where they're cheaper, and they'll integrate those commitments within their trade and aid policies, within their spheres of influence. And so you see not one market, as I originally conceived when I was in the World Bank, of everybody, of course, going to the lowest cost abatement, and that was obviously in the developing countries whose energy systems were less developed. It comes down to the unique nature of a country's juxtaposition with the world. Japan will create its own form of emissions reductions, and it will have relationships, bilateral relationships with various countries that it happens to trade with and feels comfortable doing business with. And so for Mitsui in Kenya, we will create around about 2 million tons of carbon a year from clean cooking solutions for the rural poor for the Japanese market, part of Japanese Inc., the corporate government relationship which governs the economy. The Swiss government, on the other hand, is saying, we agree that one Swiss cent for every liter of petroleum that's sold in our economy goes into a foundation called the Click Foundation. And that should be used to buy emissions reductions, but only within certain kinds of activities, not all activities, and only in certain countries that they feel are above the line in terms of corruption and good governance. And they're very different. South Korean government has done exactly the same thing. We supply the Korean market with about 7 million tons a year of emissions reductions. And they expressly said, we only want those emissions reductions to come from the poorest countries and the poorest communities in activities which are of distributed energy efficiency. They said nothing else suits. Actually been a painful process dealing with the South Korean government in that respect, but nevertheless, what I'm trying to say is every country will build into its compliance framework a certain amount that can be done through policies and measures at home, a certain amount that can be done through cap and trade regimes if they want to go to a market-based approach. And they will look at the impact of that cap and trade regime in terms of the cost burden on the economy. In Europe now, you're getting to 50 euros per ton in the EU allowances. Will it go to 100 when you can go buy emissions reductions for 10? These are trade-offs that they will make. So emissions reductions from the developing countries under Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement and even Article 6.4, the market-based mechanism, are really designed to give the voluntary commitments of the OECD, the industrialized countries, the opportunity to lower their cost of abatement and accelerate their commitments to manage climate change. The most stupid policies say, I've got to do it all at home. Because you know very well, they're not going to go and pay $100 plus per ton right now, or $200 a ton. And if you have integrity in offsets, and you have the opportunity to transform the energy sector and the agricultural sector and land management in developing countries at a much lower cost, why wouldn't you do that? That's the dynamic. That's the dynamic nature of the relationship between offsets and domestic measures and cap and trade regimes.
Yeah, so I've got a two-part question. I was wondering how you actually access employment finance and what potentially system means, like this privatized system means, to worsen inequalities itself. I mean, you've got your company that's looking at inequality and thinking about it, but what other companies are actually?
Okay, so I didn't hear much of that. You've got the louder voice in front, can you?
Yeah, we'll talk later. The question is essentially,
how do you get access to it? Like, what kind of organisation do you need to be? Or,
do we need to be?
And who is accessing it? And what potential does that system in itself have to worsen inequality?
I suppose one way of answering that is it comes back on a reflection of what kind of company, the evolution of private companies. It's a much bigger question which has been evolving for quite a long time. The role of private companies versus public versus governments, and how private companies, following the Chicago school, how a private companies should behave, narrowly focused on shareholder wealth. And the evolution of that model, which is now quite dramatic in the US, saying that it should go beyond shareholder profitability. It should go to a much higher level of social responsibility, and that is actually economically sensible. What I'm proposing, and that's for publicly traded companies, so what's the responsibilities of the management of those companies, and how broad should their remit be? What I'm saying is that there's another opportunity for private companies to seek profitability through mutual prosperity in the developing countries. That if they're conscientious about recycling capital to improve the well-being of the communities they serve, they will find more and more ways of investing in the growth of those communities which service their own profit generation. And it's almost a never-ending net as far as I can see, given the evolution of our business. But it does require private companies to have commitments to social goals and environmental goals, which is unusual. But what I hope to demonstrate is that, well, first of all, if I do not create significant profitability for my investors, like Macquarie Bank, how can I possibly hope to draw more of their capital and their expertise, giant investment bank compared to my small company? How can I bring them into that paradigm? So this is not about telling companies that they should invest in areas or take lower returns. It's saying to companies, look more clearly at your opportunity. There's opportunities to make significant profits and to restore and recycle those profits into communities who are at the very beginning of their development journey. And in fact, given where the world is going, and especially where Africa is going with half the population under 15, you can do what Goldman Sachs always used to tell me, and I never believed when I was a managing director there, was that you can do well by doing good. You can't do well by doing good if you make 10% returns. No one's going to be attracted to bring to those kinds of returns. You have to demonstrate that by improving the prosperity of communities and increasing their capacity to produce beyond their basic needs for trade, that you can facilitate that trade, provide route to market, and generate additional profits while being conscientious about the source of growth, which is fundamentally the well-being of women. And what I hope to do is show other sources of capital who want to seek the sorts of returns that we are making, that they shouldn't ignore the developing countries. They should see them as the new frontier. And if they have a vision of development which is concerned with the mutual prosperity of themselves and those communities, that they can become the new development paradigm, because development finance institutions are not getting the job done. It's just not happening. So what else do we have? So yeah, not all companies are like that, but you know, my sense is if I can demonstrate serious profitability to the likes of Macquarie Bank or Temasek through what we're doing, and they see that everybody is benefiting in the process, I will draw more capital, more technology, more know-how into that area, which is otherwise an economic desert in decline. I don't know whether it's going to work, but I'm giving it my best shot. Okay.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.